President Trump's effort to fire Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook is testing the Fed's don't panic strategy. In a new piece for Politico, our next guest explains, quote, in one sense, Trump's move against Cook is seismic, an apparent declaration that he will not stop escalating his assault on the Fed until its policymakers come to heel and dramatically lower interest rates. But in another sense, it feels like just another temperature increase as Trump tries to boil the central bank frog. Joining us now, the author of that piece, economics correspondent for Politico, Victoria Guida. So you say, as the first line in this piece, the Federal Reserve is not a place that panics, and yet it has found itself either in the midst of seismic shifts because of the president or just being boiled in a pot like the frog in boiling water, which I think is such an evocative metaphor for the way that the Fed and, frankly, multiple institutions in America are being tested right now. I mean, talk about what you're hearing internally at the Fed, and then we'll talk external implications.
Yeah, so President Trump, in terms of the boiling of the frog, has already sort of shifted how we think about the relationship between the president and the Fed, at least publicly. Even going back to his first term, he's criticized them. But now this latest with Lisa Cook is an escalation of that fight in a way that's very direct, where he might actually be removing somebody. And it's difficult for the Fed to sort of figure out how to navigate this because we still don't completely know the facts of the case. She's been accused of mortgage fraud. We don't know if she's committed mortgage fraud. And so they're trying to sort of tread carefully and take things as it comes. And that's where the boiling of the frog comes in because, you know, the more that he brings in situations where they can't just say, hey, you're attacking our independence because there's this question of mortgage fraud, the more complicated it is for them.
And what they're trying to do is drive at that idea of for cause, because that is where a president could have the ability to actually fire someone within the Fed. And the reason that it's an open question is because they're an independent entity, right? So when you're talking to your sources within the Fed or over on Wall Street, what are they saying about if they are successful in being able to fire Lisa Cook for cause, despite the fact that these are unproven allegations? What does that then say? What kind of floodgate does that open?
So it's never actually been litigated before what for cause means. And so it does make it a little bit easier to remove people once you have a little more legal clarity around that. And one of the reasons why the Lisa Cook situation is so complicated is because obviously, mortgage fraud is bad, and it seems like a reasonable grounds potentially for removing somebody. But the question is whether, are you going to have these sort of politically targeted investigations that are clearly targeted also at interest rates? And so that kind of puts the institution under threat generally, where people are maybe going to be digging into their past to find anything to remove them.
I also feel like the Fed, in all my years in Washington, is something that we always look to for rates, for the ways that they're talking about the economy. But we have never truly focused in on the internal dynamics in large part in the way that we're doing right now. I mean, you've covered this building for about a decade. What do you see in this present moment as someone who knows what the Fed usually is so well?
Yeah, so the Fed actually has a very complicated structure. And one of the things that's so strange about this moment is that, all of a sudden people are learning about how it works, which is when it comes to be something that's supposed to be boring, that usually means that, something is not necessarily going well. Yeah. They have the 7-member board. They have these 12 Reserve Bank presidents. And one of the big questions with if they remove Lisa Cook is whether all of a sudden President Trump might be able to have a majority of the board. And then in February, all 12 of the regional bank presidents, because there are presidents all around the country that don't respond to the president, that aren't nominated by the president, and all of those people are up for reappointment in February. They're up for reappointment every 5 years, and so this could completely shift the balance of the Fed to President Trump's people.
What do people anticipate if Trump is able to remake the Fed in his image, or in a way that the people who are there know that they are sort of beholden to his policy whims, which, again, is not the way that the Fed has operated?
Yeah, so the concern is that historically, if a central bank is responding to political pressures rather than looking at the data and trying to make judgments about what's best for the long-term interests of the economy, a lot of times that leads to rates being lower than they otherwise would be, because in the short term, that sort of gooses the economy. It allows for more economic activity. But over the longer term, it can lead to more inflation, which then can lead to actually higher rates over time. And actually, you're seeing in markets, you're seeing longer term rates, the rates that affect mortgages, you're seeing those go up. And it's because markets are thinking, OK, if President Trump has more control over the Fed, that can mean more inflation over the long term, which will ultimately mean that whenever the Fed does really have to crack down on inflation, they're going to have to raise rates higher than they otherwise would.
Yeah, I think that all of that is so important as viewers try to figure out, okay, the independent reserve, Federal Reserve, I get that, but what does it mean for me? A lot of people are wondering, when can I buy a house? What does inflation look like? What is cost of living? That then becomes a political question, but I think it's really fascinating to watch the ways that these things play together. And again, in a way that typically the Fed is pretty predictable, pretty cautious. Politics, of course, more spontaneous, more reactive. Those are two very different ways to operate, and we're watching them come in collision with each other. Victoria Guida, it's a fascinating piece, beautifully written. I was telling you during the break. We love having you. Thank you for coming on and explaining it to us.